Now, all of us who love this channel are quite familiar with the Commodore 64, so in this video, I actually want to look at the famous breadbox as one of those people who went from merely curious, watching this channel, to actual collector. Has the experience of actually buying a vintage Commodore 64 made me regret going from observer to owner? My name is Johnny Hemberger, and I host a local AM radio show here in Houston called Geek Therapy Radio. And of course, since it's 2019, it's also a podcast and a YouTube channel. I'll put all the links below. And if you considered subscribing to any of it, I would truly be honored. I know YouTube is saturated with this kind of stuff, so even your consideration would mean a lot. I mean that from the bottom of my geek heart. But enough about all that. Let's actually have a fond look at this blast from the past.
Not all geeks are nerds.
Yeah.
This is Geek Therapy Radio.
What are we waiting for?
And now your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger.
Much like myself and the 1983 DeLorean I'm driving, the Commodore 64 is an iconic early 80s baby. Unlike myself and my DeLorean, the Commodore 64 was incredibly successful and well-built. Now I've made myself sad. Anyways, not to go into too much history, a data point relevant to this video are the C64's sales numbers. The Commodore 64 is still the most popular single computer of all time, selling between 10 million and 17 million units depending on who you ask. So even at its lowest estimate, a crap load. And that means if you're curious about getting into 8-bit computers, finding a Commodore 64 can be quite a bit easier than starting with one of the C64's less successful counterparts. What that also means is a bustling and very active online Commodore community with an enormous wealth of knowledge to help you along your way, further reducing the anxiety of actually picking one up. So not only is the Commodore community active, there's a myriad of software available and aftermarket add-ons to further alleviate the struggle of actually loading said software. In brief, SD cards have replaced tape and disk drives. Nothing against original hardware. As you get further down the rabbit hole, you'll likely look to add a dataset or 1541 to your collection. But loading programs off an SD card will help you learn the ins and outs in the meantime. Those who grew up with the Commodore 64 remember how frustrating loading programs from tape could be, so anything that helps alleviate initial frustrations for newcomers is a welcome thing. We want more people to get into vintage computing. If the first thing they experience is frustration, that could turn them away before they even begin. Believe me, the frustrations will come as you get deeper. At least this way, you'll be pretty far along the learning curve to solve any eventual problems. And that leads me to this point. I've had my Commodore 64 for about 2 years now after never owning one prior. The first computer I ever used in my life was the Apple II in our elementary school computer lab. My first home computer was a 386 Packard Bell. A few of my friends had C64s, and to be honest, by the early 90s, those friends were the butt of jokes on the playground. We were running around trying to collect a complete set of smuggled DOS Doom installation disks while the C64 kids felt a little left out. But as I grew older into my 30s, my interest grew in the Commodore 64, so much that I simply had to have one. So I found a seller here in Houston, hopped in my DeLorean out of full vintage experience necessity, and picked one up for about $200. You can find them cheaper, but the seller is a local electrical engineer and had thoroughly and lovingly restored both it and the power supply. Power supplies have been known to be faulty, so I appreciated a fair price for a perfect working example without all of the smoke tests on my end. So that's actually my first bit of advice. If you're handy with schematics and a soldering iron, a cheap, non-working Commodore 64 is a fun project. If you're not handy with flux or just don't want the project for, whatever reason, be prepared to pay a little more for a good example. But even in the world of vintage computing, $200 or so for a perfect example is chump change compared to what you can pay for other retro computers. So why did I buy a Commodore 64? What about it won me over enough to move from passing fancy to actual owner? Honestly, I've thought about this question a lot. I've been asked by 8-bit outsiders what the appeal could possibly be.
What's the point?
Some of them remember those headaches of loading tapes and pulling their hair out when discs fail. The age of the smartphone is amazing, but, has spoiled us in many ways. I fell in love with the romance of vintage computing. Using a Commodore 64 gives me a similar satisfaction to writing a song or signing off of a good broadcast. Using the C64 really is a creative outlet. Getting it to do anything correctly takes work. A syntax error feels like hitting the wrong note on a piano. Stringing together commands and physical operations to load a program or even a crappy video game feels like putting musical notes together in harmony. It is pleasing to the heart, soul, and mind. For my heart, it brings me to a simpler time in my life and brings back fond memories. For my soul, it brings satisfaction of slowing down in this fast-paced world to do something with intention, correctly, rather than instantly and without purpose. For my mind, it requires my full attention to every action and every keystroke. It doesn't work unless my brain is fully involved. A slug crawling across a phone screen can open an app. Changing the background color of the C64, however, takes conscious effort. So using a Commodore 64 or almost any vintage computer develops useful skills that translate beneficially to other areas of life. In brief, to slow down, analyze, and execute decisions with purpose. I know that the phrase slow down sounds like blasphemy in the modern age, but it isn't a bad concept. There's a saying I've heard a lot while learning to play guitar, and it's as true today as it was, back for Mozart. That phrase is, accuracy begets speed. The Commodore forces you to slow down and be deliberate with your keystrokes. After a little time, you'll get so accurate that you naturally become fast and efficient. This principle applies to many different areas of life with positive results. Whereas prior to owning a Commodore 64, you might make brazen decisions without much thought, using a Commodore might train your brain to take a beat, analyze the situation, make a more informed decision, and be more deliberate in general with your actions. As I'm saying all of this, it really seems like a form of geek zen. Getting into a tinkering groove for hours with a Commodore 64 is a lot like meditating. Motorcyclists know what I'm talking about. On a motorcycle, you are hyper-aware and constantly making critical decisions. After a while, your brain seems to reach a level where you're hyper-aware but tuned into your subconscious. It's like a waking dream state. In other words, you get into the zone. And tinkering with the Commodore 64 often puts me into this zone. That alone is worth the price of admission. So maybe that's it after all. To answer the question of why I bought a Commodore 64 and whether or not you should go from observer to owner, it isn't just for the nostalgia. There's so much more to it that will surprise you. Buying and tinkering with a Commodore 64 could actually make you a better, happier person. What it offers is so much more than a passing conversation piece to add to your collection. The modern age, with all of our high-resolution graphics, immersive gameplay, and instant access, is truly amazing. I adore modern technology. It is beyond awesome to ride the cutting edge. But using the Commodore 64 is like stepping out of virtual reality in a sense. It makes you take inventory of your existence and ask what's really important to you. I know this all might sound a little pedantic, but believe me, sooner or later you make a profound and unexpected realization that in a house fire, you'd leave your iPad and grab the Commodore. Sooner or later, you realize that the Commodore 64 is giving you something that mindless scrolling doesn't. So I think that's it. Sitting here in the DeLorean, I ask what matters more to me. What gives me more happiness? What brings me real joy? My 350 horsepower, blisteringly fast, high-tech daily driver? Or this slow, wheezy, 100% manual DeLorean? And the answer is the DeLorean. I can't feel the road in my state-of-the-art modern car. In the DeLorean, I'm 100% connected to the world. I know what's going on around me. I can feel it. It takes my concentration and effort. It makes me enjoy driving while making me a better driver. I've never been in a traffic accident with any car, knock on wood, and it's precisely because of the good habits I've learned by driving an old car. And that's what the Commodore 64 does. It makes you appreciate and better at all that we do have because of what it doesn't have. So as a casual collector who was on the fence about getting a Commodore 64, am I happy after taking the plunge and actually buying one? Yes, absolutely and unequivocally. I thought by buying it I was merely indulging unquantifiable nostalgia. In actuality, it has made my life better quantifiably. It made me happier and more involved in the human experience. The Commodore 64 can't do much, but it can do a lot for you. And that's exactly why you should consider getting off the fence and getting one. I hope you've enjoyed this introspective look at the beloved Commodore 64. Thank you for joining me. And I'll save my plug for last. If you like this video, I'd be honored at your mere consideration of subscribing to my YouTube channel. You have a lot of choice on this saturated outlet, so it is not unappreciated that you even consider subscribing to my channel. It means a lot. It really, really does. Of course, I'll leave a link to my channel and links to the podcast version of Geek Therapy Radio. We're all geeks about something, and that's a beautiful thing worth celebrating. In a world so divisive, just know that you're not alone and you're always welcomed. So embrace your geek thing, be good to yourself and others, and hopefully I'll see you in the future.